Chapter 4, Blame. Mom always says that Potter men sometimes just need to go out to Granddad's shed and have our heads put back together. When I was a child, this generally happened when we needed to have a stern talking to, and Dad, who knew his limitations, was laughing too hard to do it properly. Once when James and I got into it, I turned him into an ass. Not on purpose, it was accidental magic. But Mom and Dad took one look and laughed, and actually had to hold on to each other to keep from falling over. Luckily, we were at the burrow. All they had to do was point, and I knew what I had to do. So I trudged out to the shed and listened to an impromptu lecture on why we don't turn our brothers into asses. But now I sort of found myself wanting some advice. I've been feeling off all day. I was home from school. We've been given special dispensation to attend the annual celebration of the defeat of Voldemort, and then to just stay home until the Christmas holidays started the day after. And every time I thought about either Voldemort or Emily Wilder, I felt this incandescent rage that started in my bones and radiated outward, so that waves of fury traveled over my skin again and again. This was not a pleasant feeling. I wish Dad was here, I thought savagely, as I did pretty much every day. It just seemed grossly unfair that the entire freaking world would celebrate what he had done, and he was moldering in his grave. Yeah, he'd survived that asshole, but he died before he was even 40. Heroes were supposed to live long lives and grow old with a girl and see their grandchildren be born, which might be sooner rather than later. James had made his way through practically every girl in Gryffindor and was now seeing a Hufflepuff, though we all knew that he'd end up with Sarah Black. I opened the shed door with more force than I intended. Granddad jumped and banged his head on the low-floating lantern. I grimaced apologetically while he swore. "Morning, Al," he said, rubbing his head and wincing. "Morning, Granddad," I said. I already sounded belligerent. "I don't want to go today. In fact, I'm not going to go today." "Oh," he said, lifting an eyebrow. I once heard Dad say that Granddad is unflappable in the face of children, and it's true. Granddad always attributes it to raising my dead twin uncles. He always says, "I raised Fred and George," with that look that was a mixture of weariness, resignation, and the type of grief that I hadn't understood until the funeral of my father. "Yeah," I said, crossing my arms. "It's a stupid waste of time. None of you ever want to go," I said accusingly. "Dad hated going, you know that." "It's true that I always dread going," he said calmly. "But I would feel worse if I didn't go. I understand that it has something to do with your father, Dash." "It has nothing to do with him." I lied loudly. I immediately felt guilty for yelling at Granddad. "Sorry," I muttered. I ruffled my hair. When he was here, it was pretty amazing. And it had been. One of my earliest memories was of sitting on Dad's shoulders and watching the fireworks, pulling at his hair so tightly that I had hanks of it in my hands at the end of the evening. I hadn't understood at all what was being celebrated, and why a huge crowd of people had treated Dad with respect bordering on worship. But now it doesn't seem like there's much to celebrate. Granddad fiddled around with the calculator that lay on the table. I knew that he wasn't really tinkering with it. He was just gathering his thoughts. "I often feel the same way," he admitted finally. "I've buried 2 children, and believe me, that sort of pain never goes away. Not a day goes by when I don't think of them. They weren't even supposed to be there," he said. His voice had an odd note in it, as though he was still surprised that his sons were gone, even after all these years. "But your uncles, they were a force of nature," he chuckled. "Nothing could stop them, not really. It's Voldemort's fault," I said suddenly. I wanted to clap a hand over my mouth. Maybe he'll think that I meant Uncle Fred and Uncle George, I thought hopefully. But Granddad was too astute for that. "He was sick, Al," he said gently. "It had nothing to do with Voldemort." I looked away and glared mutinously at the wall. I hated to admit it, but Granddad was wrong. Yeah, maybe Voldemort hadn't used the killing curse on Dad again, but maybe if he hadn't had such a hard life, he would have been stronger. I may have only been 14 at the time, but I've got ears. The healers had said that he couldn't fight whatever sickness he'd contracted because his constitution was weak. Dad was the strongest wizard in Britain, so that asshole Voldemort must have whittled away at him. And getting hit with the killing curse twice was no joke, either. I hid my hands in the folds of my robes to hide the fact that I was trembling with rage. I couldn't fool Granddad. He put his hand on my shoulder, and I immediately felt the backs of my eyes sting, and I was about half a hair away from crying. Not that that hadn't happened before in this place. I hate to admit, but I was a sensitive child and used to cry whenever Granddad raised his voice just a little. Thankfully, that had ended when I was about 5. So it wasn't like I'd be embarrassed or anything, but I knew that the pressure in my chest that seemed like a pretty constant companion would just get worse if I let it out. "There are things you don't understand," Granddad murmured. "I understand perfectly well." I bit out before I could stop myself. I squeezed my eyes closed. Dad died because Voldemort weakened him. It was like a constant refrain in my head. The prophecy hadn't turned out to be in favor of Dad, after all, because if he hadn't been the stupid chosen one, he would have died of old age. I could see it so vividly in my head. Dad, scarless, would be waiting inside the burrow with Mum, Uncle Ron, and Aunt Hermione. He'd be excited about going to the celebration, not moaning and groaning, because the chosen one would have been Neville Longbottom, and I'd heard stories about him all my life. Maybe Neville could have survived past 40, and everyone would be so happy with Neville out of St. Mungo's. "I'll dash." "Listen," I said. I tried to smile. "I'm sorry for being stupid. I'm going to the celebration, and I've got to go get ready for it, I guess." I was lying. The event wasn't for another 3 hours, and I wasn't Lily, who needed that amount of time to get ready. I left before Granddad could stop me.